what I'd like to tell you more about is TrueAllele databasing, which is really helpful in cold cases. And I'm going to introduce this by talking about the automated TrueAllele databases. TrueAllele was built with DNA databasing in mind. It has a database that drives the system. It also has matching databases where essentially all genotypes that are found, we don't make any limits on them. It's not like CODIS where there's some criteria. It's a whole story I talked about in 2014 here, that the false positive rate is so high with incorrect matches based on allele sharing in CODIS, because they don't use probabilistic genotypes for their matching. They have to block the upload of most mixtures. So you're not getting the upload. So you gather the evidence, you collect it, goes to the lab, and then they can't upload it because it doesn't meet some old criterion that doesn't actually measure information, but it measures the chance that on their lists of alleles database from a method that's over 20 years old, they're going to get false positive hits. With TrueAllele, it's all based on genotypes and probabilities. If you have a 5-person mixture, all 5 genotypes with their probabilities go onto the database. And it's completely automated if we set it up that way. All the genotypes go up, everything is automatically compared with everything, and as you'll see in the study from Cleveland in just a minute, we can harvest the results. Or you can harvest the results, and you can see what's associated with what. So the automation is really important. You don't need to have people involved in this. It's all machines and math working objectively and without human effort. Most DNA software requires, not TrueAllele, it requires a lot of human preparation. People have to look at the data, they have to look at thresholds, they have to make expert decisions of what data to use, what not to use, maybe what parameters to twiddle. None of that happens in TrueAllele. So you don't need armies of people to run this. It's done, which is why we can do things like free screening. It doesn't take a lot for us to run it through a system to get a first result. Why would you want to have a TrueAllele database or have access to one? Because you want to connect the DNA dots between different events. You might want to reopen the past and have a computer go through all of your old DNA evidence that in a county or an investigation where you know it was underinterpreted because those were the interpretation methods of the lab at the time. Well, if you have the data, which the lab keeps, all of that can be reanalyzed. And we have laboratories that use TrueAllele that have gone back and reanalyzed all their data. And in the process, on the database, not just evidence to references, but evidence to evidence, crime scene to crime scene. Sometimes the results don't mean much. Sometimes it's contamination. But sometimes they're finding completely new evidence that they weren't expecting because it's just a computer comparing every crime scene to every crime scene through the genotypes. So you might even imagine that you have cases where there's oodles of DNA. It was analyzed a while ago, and nobody could do anything with it. And yet, if only you could connect the different scenes, the different items, you'd know more about what was going on. So we do that, and some of our crime labs do that to reopen past cases. We've done a lot with gang crimes. That's the story I'll be telling you about from the Cleveland study that the prosecutors requested. And with handguns, I mean, handguns may not be a problem in your county, but they're a problem in other counties, right? There are a lot of handguns out there now. And handguns typically are about 5-6-person mixtures. So most crime labs that we know shy away from them. They don't like them. Whereas imagine that you had a bunch of handguns and you automatically ran the data through TrueAllele, and every genotype was compared with every genotype, and now you're finding that there's one person whose DNA is on multiple handguns, or these different handguns are connected with the people who've touched them. That's the type of problem TrueAllele solves. So just think about it. Maybe you have investigations with handguns. Retail theft. I only say this because we saw this in the paper the other day, and there was your name, right? People are stealing things. So we're working on projects that involve DNA and connecting items with retail theft. We worked on a pilot project with drug counterfeiting, trying to identify who's counterfeiting drugs through the use of DNA. For mass disasters and missing people, Jeff Bainey suggested I stay and give another hour talk at 4 o'clock. Probably not. You may have other plans. Fortunately, he'll be sending out a link to a talk I gave last month at a 9/11 conference 20 years on at Duquesne University, where it's a pretty leisurely talk. It's much slower than this one. It was a very general, broad audience. And I described how in 2005, Cybergenetics used TrueAllele on the World Trade Center DNA data to reassociate the 18,000 victim remains with the 2,700 missing people. And as I start off, there are no people, right? This isn't like an investigation. You've got a reference sample that you can put in. There are no people, but that is the problem. There are no references. All you have left from the missing people are their relatives from which TrueAllele can reconstruct genotypes and their personal effects like sweaters or toothbrushes, which are usually mixtures or something. So this is a project where TrueAllele was able to develop the genotypes from both the victim remains and from the missing people, personal effects and the relatives, make the comparisons. It was tested by a crime lab in New York City and presented at a conference as a validation study. It worked. And the reason you might enjoy the talk is that we tried something new, which is instead of giving dull recitation of scientific facts like you've been subjected to for the last hour, we introduced a fictitious character, Sarah, and show her picture and her family and say, okay, so she was blown up during the World Trade Center. How do we go through every step in the TrueAllele process with her remains, her family, what did we actually do to provide that closure? So it's a much more listenable talk, and I think Jeff said he'd send the link out to it. We just posted it last week. Something else that some of our labs do is automated familial search. That's more of a West Coast thing, but we can set up TrueAllele to automatically develop the genotypes of the relatives of people to find the relatives of people who've left their DNA and evidence on DNA databases. And that's something else that can be done, is to find people through their relatives. And that's, again, can be done in a totally automated way. TrueAllele doesn't have a limitation of other DNA evidence databases. We use all the data, we upload all genotypes, and we don't provide weak association statistics like CODIS or ESCAS. We provide likelihood ratios and error rates, much more exact and scientific. So what I'd like to do is tell you something about the study that we did with the Cuyahoga County Lab in Cleveland, Ohio, about 2 or 3 years ago. And this comes from a talk that DNA technical leader Dr. Butt presented at the American Academy meeting. So these are not my slides. I didn't make them. This is Dr. Butt's slides. Use of a database feature in the TrueAllele casework system to cross-compare DNA cases. The problem they had was that there were auto thefts, probably committed by juveniles, 2015. It's a gang crime. And the cars are stolen, they're unlocked, windows smashed. Just a lot of destruction of property. So what we end up with in this project is about 160 evidence items that are taken from 37 different incidents. And there are also about 38 suspect reference profiles. And the project that the DA's office had been working on from the juvenile division was very labor intensive, but it wasn't making full use of DNA evidence. So the question was, what if they took all this DNA, the data files they had, they sent it to Cybergenetics, we reprocessed it for them, and I'll show you what they saw. We processed it on our servers, and then we uploaded the results to a server in the cloud. They had the viewer software so they could look at the results, and then they could see what the connections were. And this is what they found. They want to do this efficiently, and manual interpretation using weaker methods like random match probability, that's assuming that a mixture isn't a mixture. So it's a bad assumption because you see three people there and you assume there's one. So you're behind the eight ball before you start. Or this combined probability of inclusion method, that's with the thresholds, throwing out the data. It's very uninformative. They knew they weren't getting great results, and it was very, very labor intensive, and they were ignoring most of the data. And to Dr. Butt, this is a problem. He likes getting accurate information from data. He's a PhD scientist, he takes data seriously. So with the manual interpretation, their threshold was up at 200 RFU. That means anything under that level, peaks that could come from different people who've touched items or smashed things, they're not used. Anything over 200, whether it's 300 or 3,000, it's the same. So all this data is being thrown out by these methods. And then they can't, so we see you can't process beyond 3 contributors. And these are the rules they're following to throw out a lot of data to even begin to look at it. They took months from the initial testing. I'm not going to go through all this, but essentially at the bottom what you're seeing is 30 evidence samples contained no or insufficient amount of DNA. That's the same language you see, insufficient DNA. You're not going to get an answer. The DNA is not going to be looked at. It's not going to be compared by manual methods. 30 profiles reported as inconclusive due to too many contributors to the mixture. The same language. There's either too little DNA, or there's too many people present in the DNA item. And so they're now using TrueAllele. They were starting to adopt it. I had testified in some Daubert hearings they had in their county. And so they sent us the files. We ran everything through, and what they were most interested in is that we were looking at their results that they had thought were inconclusive. That's what they wanted to know. What was the additional information that TrueAllele was going to get relative to their laboratory process in doing this large manual database comparison, comparing all these items and people. And the match rules on the bottom, let me interpret that for you, because you have all these genotypes, but what do you compare against what? EVI stands for evidence. So EVI-EVI means evidence to evidence comparison. That means we're comparing the genotypes from a swab from one car to the genotypes from a swab from maybe the same car, more often a different car. We're comparing crime scene to crime scene, evidence to evidence. That's the kind of thing crime labs generally don't do at all. But it's the sort of thing you might be interested in if you're working on a difficult cold case homicide. How do you connect the different items of evidence? Who's there? Who's in common? The EVI-ref. So EVI to EVI, evidence to evidence. Ref stands for reference. Now the question with EVI to reference is they have some references. They have some suspects. They had some juveniles in their DNA. They want to know, are those individuals on the evidence items that can help them resolve the crimes to an actual person? And reference to reference is just more for contamination testing and so on. Are there any quality control issues? What happens in TrueAllele is we set this up in the database, and it's all automatic. We set up a channel for comparing all evidence to all evidence. It just happened automatically. All those probabilistic genotypes from different items get compared. We set up another path for comparing all evidence to all references. That just happens automatically in the background. And then we can also do the quality checking for contamination with reference to reference. What's important to recognize is nobody is doing this. The computer's doing this. We're just shoveling the data into the system, and it knows how to do only 2 things in the world, but it does them really well. It knows how to separate those mixtures or look at low-level samples. It knows how to infer genotypes reliably and accurately. And the second thing it knows how to do automatically in this database is it knows how to compare the genotypes to get match statistics. That's all it knows how to do. But basically nothing else knows how to do that. So and if people do it, you lose a lot of information, and it's very tedious and expensive and time consuming. So those are the three pairings that are happening: comparing evidence items, checking against people, and quality checking. And as Dr. Butt showed, they enter the process on their interface. So imagine like you might do, they've sent us the data, we've done all the processing, we've taken this database, uploaded it to a secure cloud, and now they, or you, have software like what you're looking at with some training, so they know how to do the investigation on the DNA now. So, new resource for looking at a crime scene, multiple crime scenes. And this is what Dr. Butt showed at the conference. He has the software, he has this match button, he clicks on it, and now he indicates what part of the matches he's interested in looking at. And you can see here there's evidence and reference. So he has different naming for how he's looking at these different pairwise comparisons. He's comparing to suspects, he's comparing to, I'm not sure what IC stands for, but I think it's evidence. And now he's drilling down. He can drill down at the item level, at the genotype level, at the match level, and take a look at the specific requests. So this is a lot of data, but what he's really looking at is there's this center column of match statistics, the one that says starts at 24. So ranking 24 is a trillion. It goes down to 20. And now he's showing the pairing of the items, so through their genotypes. And this interface lets you look at what's happening at the individual genotype level, if you really want to see it, which you probably don't. So you can go up and take a look at the specific computer run that was done, which is probably still more specific, but the scientists like that. But really the power is the computer can collate all this, and you're now looking at this item versus that item through their genotypes without worrying about the details based on the strength of match. How strongly is this item, this swab from this car, matching this swab from across town on another car? That's what the interface lets you do without having to do a lot of legwork. It's like, just show me the results of item to item based on match strength. That's what the database is showing. This is EVI to ref, which means they're now finding the people that they had as suspects and seeing how involved are they in these crimes. Maybe they're not involved at all, maybe they're really involved. Well, this is one person who is automatically linked to 8 different cases. Again, this isn't a human analyst sitting and looking at it. The computer just does it, and then you can look at the results. You can say, show me everything to this one person. The match results come up to the different items. And that's something that you can do with training. It's something we could do for you, but here you had Dr. Butt's group and the DA's office doing it because that was what they wanted to interact with. Okay, so his point here is that we found more links, more suspects, and his summary is lots of results. They found some more suspects. They found, here are lots of details. But here's the real thing. 30 profiles were reported by the lab as inconclusive, and TrueAllele found information on every one of those. I mean, when I went through the slides to see what would be interesting, I thought that was the most interesting thing. Every inconclusive was informative when reanalyzed by TrueAllele, and 12 of the samples that were reported as exclusions turned into positive match scores. They were no longer exclusions. So you're just getting so much more information out of the same DNA data for no effort by using a computer that's designed for it. And so that's the database message of TrueAllele. And I think I'll stop there. In fact, I'll use his slide. Thank you. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them now or hang around later. Thank you very much.